In the dust-stained towns of the frontier, lives were bartered for less than the price of a drink. This is the story of a weary cowboy, a silent Apache woman, and the fire that bound them through storm, sorrow, and second chances. A tale of survival, dignity, and love, born not from choice but from the unforgiving hands of the Wild West. The sun was slipping behind the far mesas when Luke Halpern guided his horse up the rutted track that led to his homestead. Dust clung to his boots, his coat, and the mane of the gelding beneath him, turning every line of him the color of the fading earth. Behind him, tethered by a length of rawhide rope, walked the Apache woman. Her steps were steady, neither hurried nor reluctant, as if each mile mattered little once the first mile had passed. Her braids, long and dark, caught the last of the light like two cords of polished obsidian. She did not speak. She had not spoken since the moment the trade was struck. 2 drinks and a sack of wheat. That was the sum that had changed the course of her life and his. Luke could still smell the sour whiskey and hear the laughter of the men in the saloon, their voices hard with mockery when he'd taken the deal. It had not been honor that moved him, nor pity. It had been weariness, the same weariness that had driven him to drink alone in a corner, staring at his calloused hands as though they were someone else's. The cabin appeared at the edge of the cottonwoods, roof sagging, porch warped by years of sun and rain. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney as it once had when Clara, his wife, kept the fire lively and the kettles warm. That smoke had been a sign of welcome, a sign that the house was more than shelter. Now it was a hollow place of timber and dust, a box of memories he could not seem to sweep out no matter how he tried. Luke dismounted slowly, his joints aching with the tiredness of a man older than his years. He tied the horse to the post and turned, expecting the woman to stop a few paces off. She did. Her eyes flicked to the house, then to the land stretched wide and silent around them. Coyotes were already beginning their dusk calls in the distance, high-pitched and sorrowful. She met his gaze for the first time since the road began. Her eyes were not pleading nor afraid. They were unreadable, stone under moonlight. "This is it," Luke muttered, half to her, half to himself. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, rusty from disuse. He pushed open the cabin door. The hinges groaned, echoing the emptiness inside. The smell struck him first. Old ashes, dry wood, and faint traces of Clara's lavender soap that lingered in the boards, though she'd been gone near 3 winters. The shawl she favored still lay across the rocking chair by the fire, folded with the precision of a hand long absent. Dust filmed the Bible on the shelf, its leather cover cracked at the edges. The woman stepped in behind him, her moccasins making no sound on the warped floorboards. She did not cross to the hearth or the chair. Instead, she paused near the far corner and stood still, as if claiming the shadows as her portion. Her presence did not fill the space. It seemed to narrow it, to remind him of what was missing rather than what had come. Luke set his hat on the peg by the door. The gesture had once meant he was home, that he could breathe easy. Tonight it felt like placing a stone on a grave. "You'll find a place," he said awkwardly, gesturing to the room, though there was little to offer. A cot leaned against the far wall, unused since a hand from town stayed through harvest years ago. "That'll be yours." The woman did not nod, but she crossed to the cot and lowered herself with quiet poise, arranging her skirt around her knees. She sat straight, hands folded, her face turned toward the window where the last bands of gold and red slipped away. Luke busied himself with the fire, striking a spark into the old hearth. The flames caught reluctantly, licking at the dry wood until they rose with a crackle. Light spilled across the room, pulling shadows long against the floorboards, gilding the dust that drifted in the air. He poured water into the blackened kettle, set it to warm, and sat heavily in the chair opposite the shawl, opposite the memory of Clara. The silence pressed at him. He felt it in the hollows of his chest, in the ache behind his ribs. Once Clara would have filled that silence with soft humming, with the shuffle of skirts, with laughter that rose like birds startled from the brush. Now only the wind at the shutters and the faint creak of the rocking chair answered him. He glanced toward the woman. She remained still, her braids falling forward as she bowed her head, though whether in prayer, in grief, or in simple exhaustion, he could not tell. The firelight gleamed along the strands, each braid a rope that tied her to a life stolen and carried far from here. He wondered if she hated him already, or if hatred required more energy than she could spare. His own loneliness surged like a river after thaw. He had thought foolishly that bringing another into the house might stave off the emptiness. Instead, it seemed to sharpen it, to show him what company meant and what it did not. She was not Clara. She was not a wife. She was not even a willing companion. She was necessity wrapped in flesh, survival in the form of a stranger. Luke leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring into the fire until the heat pricked his eyes. "No one asked for this," he whispered, though whether he meant himself or the woman he could not say. The kettle hissed. He poured himself a cup, the steam curling like smoke from an unmarked grave. He did not offer her any, not yet. The air between them was too thick, too cold for such a gesture. Outside, the coyotes grew bolder, their cries stitching the night with hunger and loneliness. Inside, two souls sat in a cabin of wood and firelight, bound together not by choice nor by affection, but by the weight of a bargain neither could undo. And in that silence, Hollow and Bleak both understood the same truth. Survival had crossed their paths. Not mercy, not love. For now, it would have to be enough. The days unfolded with the slow heaviness of winter skies, each one marked by the rhythm of chores and silence. Luke rose before dawn, as he always had, the habit of ranch work etched into his bones. He split wood in the yard, the axe ringing against frozen knots, his breath puffing white into the morning air. He mended fence posts where the wind had leaned them, hammered loose nails back into weathered boards, and trudged the pasture lines with his rifle slung across his shoulder, scanning for strays. Inside the cabin, the Apache woman kept to her quiet labor. She tended the fire with careful precision, coaxing coals into steady flame. She swept the floor in long strokes that raised little spirals of dust into the light. When she found a frayed blanket in the trunk, she mended it with thread so fine it was almost invisible. She moved with an economy of effort, each gesture plain but dignified, as though every act of care was both necessary and unremarkable. Luke watched her sometimes from the yard, through the warped glass of the window. He noticed the way she bent over her work, her hair falling forward in two black cords that never came loose. She never cut it, never bound it differently. The braids seemed more than adornment. They were tether, memory, and defiance woven together. He wondered if each braid carried the weight of a story he would never hear. Everywhere her hands touched reminded him of Clara. The rocking chair creaked in the evenings when Nalin sat near the hearth, though she never rocked it long, as though unwilling to claim its rhythm. Once Luke found her folding an old quilt, the very one Clara had stitched from scraps of cotton dresses. His chest tightened at the sight. She had folded it neatly, tucked in each edge, but it felt as though a ghost's hand had done the work. One afternoon, while searching for nails in the shed, Luke's gaze fell on the tools Clara's father had left them, a rusted plow blade, a broken-handled spade, an axe head without a haft. They had not been used in years, but he could not bring himself to discard them. They seemed to hold her voice, her laughter, the life they had meant to build. Now they waited in silence, just as he did. Nights stretched longer than days. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, drumming on the roof like a second heartbeat. Luke lay awake on his bed, staring into the dark. Every drop seemed to echo the hollow within him. He could hear the woman's quiet breathing from across the cabin. The distance between them measured not in steps, but in all the unspoken words. The silence lay heavy, not cruel but weighty, like a blanket soaked through. He remembered Clara's voice on nights like these, her hymns sung low, her laughter when he teased her about her tune. He turned on his side and tried to let the sound of rain lull him, but instead it brought him to the edge of memory where loneliness stung sharper than the cold. For Nalin, the rain was a different summons. Lying in the corner, wrapped in her blanket, she remembered the night the soldiers came, rifles cracked in the dark, sparks flashing like false stars. The cries of her kin rose, then fell into silence one by one. She had clutched her sister's hand until it was torn away, until the march began. They walked through mud and dust, through hunger and fear, to a place where names were lost and traded like coin. Now, in the cabin of a stranger, she carried those echoes with her. She did not weep, though the rain would have masked it. Her face was still, her hands folded against her chest. Yet inside, each drop on the roof sounded like a drumbeat of grief, calling back what she could never retrieve. Days blurred, marked only by the repetition of tasks. Luke's grief and hers moved side by side like parallel rivers, close enough to hear the other's waters, yet never touching. He spoke little, save for muttered instructions or remarks about weather. She spoke less, her silence both shield and prison. And yet there were moments, small fleeting, when Luke felt a thread between them. The time she handed him a mended glove without a word. The time he set a tin cup of coffee on the table near her hand and, though she did not drink, she did not push it away. The wedding dress remained in the chest beneath the bed, sealed in linen yellowed by age. Luke had not touched it in months, but he felt its presence as though it were a sentinel watching them both. Sometimes, while reaching for spare shirts, he caught sight of the bundle and shut the lid quickly, as if the fabric might accuse him. He wondered if the woman knew it was there. He wondered if she thought him cruel for keeping such relics in a house where another now lived. Outside, winter gathered itself. The sky pressed low, iron-colored, and the wind cut through the cottonwoods like knives. Luke worked harder to keep the livestock safe, to stack wood high enough for the storms he knew would come. Each day, when he returned with hands raw and shoulders aching, the fire was tended, the floor swept, the blankets folded. A life maintained, though not yet shared. The silence between them remained. Yet within that silence something stirred, not comfort, not trust, but the faint recognition that both carried weights too heavy for words. He bore the absence of a wife whose laughter had once filled these walls. She bore the absence of a people scattered like leaves in the wind. And though the silence was thick and grief-soaked, it began to shape itself into something else. Not yet companionship, but acknowledgement. A language made of the scrape of the broom, the ring of the axe, the hiss of rain, the creak of a rocking chair. A language without speech but not without meaning, for now it was all they had. The air grew heavy before the storm, thick with the metallic scent of rain yet to fall. The cattle shifted restlessly in the pasture, lowing in nervous tones that carried on the rising wind. Luke tightened the cinch on his saddle, scanning the horizon. Dark clouds pressed close, swollen and bruised with thunder. He had seen storms like this before, fast, merciless, the kind that stripped roofs and drowned fields. He rode hard across the pasture, whistling sharp commands as he herded the cattle toward the shelter of the cottonwoods. Lightning cracked in the distance, white veins tearing across the sky, followed by a rumble that shook the earth beneath the gelding's hooves. Rain began to spit, then lash cold needles against his face. By the time the last steer stumbled into the corral, Luke was soaked through. His hat dripping and his hands numb, he dismounted, clapping the gelding's flank in thanks, and half ran, half stumbled toward the cabin. The wind clawed at him, tearing at his coat, hurling grit into his eyes. He shoved the door open just as the sky split wide and the storm came down in full. Inside, the cabin groaned under the assault. Rain hammered the roof, finding every weakness in the old shingles. Water streamed in thin rivulets down the walls. The fire sputtered, smoke curling low, threatening to choke out the room's one source of heat. Nalin was already moving. She tore strips from an old shirt and stuffed them into the gaps near the window frame where water seeped through. She dragged a stool under the eaves and pressed her weight against the shutter to keep it from slamming open. Her face was calm, her movements quick, as if storms were nothing new to her. Luke joined her, bracing the other shutter with his shoulder. The wood rattled like bones, each gust threatening to rip it free. His arms strained with the effort, his boots slipping on the wet floor. She leaned into her side with equal force, their shoulders close, their breaths ragged in the dim light. For a moment their hands brushed against the same latch, rough against smooth, callous against braid-bound grace. It was only an instant, yet the warmth lingered in his palm long after the shutter held fast. Together they moved from leak to leak, patching, pressing, securing what could be saved. The storm howled like a beast outside, rattling the cabin, driving sheets of rain against the walls. But within those walls 2 figures labored side by side, each relying on the other's steadiness. When at last the worst had passed, the wind easing into sighs and the rain softening to a steady drum, they collapsed near the hearth. The fire was nearly drowned, reduced to faint embers glowing weakly. Luke coaxed it back with dry kindling from a covered box. Smoke clung to the rafters, acrid and thick, but the flames caught again, pushing back the cold shadows. Luke poured water into the kettle, his hands still trembling from the strain. He set it above the revived fire and waited, the silence broken only by the steady drip of water from the roof into a tin pail. Nalin sat on the floor, her back straight despite her exhaustion. strands of hair fallen loose from her braids and plastered against her cheek. She did not wipe them away. Her eyes were fixed on the fire, dark pools that reflected the shifting light. When the kettle hissed, Luke poured 2 tin cups. He hesitated before setting one on the floor near her hand. The steam rose between them, curling and twisting like a fragile signal flag. "Coffee," he said, his voice hoarse from the shouting wind. For a moment he thought she might ignore it. Then she reached, lifted the cup, and held it close to her lips. She did not drink at once, but the simple act of accepting it filled the room with something new, something less bitter than the smoke. Their eyes met across the firelight. For the first time since she had come into his life, she did not look away. There was no accusation in her gaze, no hatred, no plea. Only weariness, deep and ancient, and something unspoken that hovered in the silence like a fragile thread. Luke felt his chest tighten, not with grief this time, but with recognition. Here was another soul weathered by storms, holding fast against winds that would have broken weaker hearts. The storm outside faded into the distance, its thunder rolling softer and softer until it was no more than a memory. Yet within the cabin something remained of it. The echo of shoulders braced together, of hands meeting in the dark, of survival shared. Luke leaned back in the chair, cradling his own cup, the heat seeping into his fingers. The woman sat across from him, silent as ever, but the silence was changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers caught in a bargain. It was the silence of those who had fought the same storm and come through alive. The fire crackled. The wind whispered against the shutters, and the coffee steamed in their cups like a truce unspoken. For the first time since her arrival, Luke allowed himself to believe they were not enemies. Perhaps not yet companions, not yet partners, but no longer two souls bound only by survival. Something had shifted as surely as the sky clears after lightning, and though neither said a word, both knew it. The days that followed the storm held a fragile stillness, as though both Luke and Nalin were careful not to disturb what had shifted between them. Yet in that stillness, the cabin itself began to change. Luke noticed it first in small ways. Above the stove, bundles of herbs now hung drying, their scents sharp and earthy, cutting through the old smoke of the hearth. He could not name them, but he recognized their use when she steeped them in hot water to soothe his cough after a day mending fences in the cold. The blankets that had frayed at the edges were now reinforced by delicate stitching, thread pulled tight by hands that worked with patience. Even scraps of cloth, old shirts worn thin, bore embroidered patterns of simple lines and shapes, designs foreign to him, yet purposeful. Luke found himself unsettled by these changes. Clara's presence was still everywhere, in the shawl folded on the rocking chair, in the faint scent of lavender soap caught in the grain of the wood, in the wedding dress sealed in its chest. And now, beside those relics of a life cut short, new patterns and scents lived, laid carefully but firmly, as if roots were being planted in ground he had believed barren. He did not know whether to resist it or to let it grow. In town, the whispers grew sharper. Men at the saloon spoke with crude laughter of the Indian woman Luke Halpern dragged home. Some shook their heads in disdain, others muttered darker things. Luke kept his eyes fixed on his drink, his jaw set tight, his hands curled into fists that he did not lift. He had no stomach for brawls, yet every word about her cut through him. He left sooner than usual, his silence carrying more weight than any reply. One evening, long after the lamps in town had gone dark, a rider approached the cabin. His horse stumbled drunkenly as the man shouted slurred words into the night. "Halpern! How much for her? Or do you keep her all to yourself?" His laughter rang harsh against the stillness of the plains. Luke rose from his chair, took his rifle from its place by the door, and stepped into the threshold. He did not raise the barrel, only rested it across his arms, his figure framed in the doorway with the firelight at his back. He stood silent as stone, eyes fixed on the man swaying in the saddle. The laughter faltered, turned uneasy, then ended altogether. With a curse, the drunk jerked his reins and rode off into the night, leaving only the pounding of hooves fading into silence. Luke lowered the rifle but did not yet put it away. He felt the weight of the night pressing down on him, heavier than the weapon in his hands. When he turned back inside, he found Nalin watching him. Her face was unreadable, but her posture was not bowed. She stood tall, her dignity intact, as though the insult thrown across the dark had not reached her. He envied her stillness, her refusal to bend before hatred. That night the cabin was quiet but for the crackle of the fire. Luke sat with the rifle across his knees, staring at the flames. His thoughts circled restless until at last he spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "My wife," he said, not looking at Nalin. "Clara. She was 20 when fever took her. 20. The words tasted bitter, shameful, as if speaking them out loud was a betrayal of the memory he had guarded so fiercely. "We had no children, just this house and plans that never had the chance to take root." He swallowed hard, his throat aching. "She died in that bed in the corner where you sleep now. I buried her on the rise beyond the cottonwoods." The silence stretched long. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. At last Nalin's voice came, halting, the words shaped by effort. "My people." "Scattered." She paused, searching. "Rifles. Fire. Crying. Many gone." Her hand lifted to her shoulder, where scars lay hidden beneath fabric. "I walk. Long. Alone." Her words were spare, broken, but they carried a weight greater than any long tale. Luke felt the air between them change, the silence no longer empty but shared. Two griefs, different in shape, lay side by side in the firelight, neither canceling the other, neither diminished. Luke set the rifle aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He could not find words to answer. He only nodded slowly once, as though acknowledging an oath spoken. Nalin lowered her hand, her face steady. She turned back to the fire, her eyes reflecting its glow. The room seemed smaller, closer, not with suffocation but with a strange intimacy. Luke realized then that protection was not ownership, and silence was not distance. She had not asked for him to guard her, yet he had. He had not asked for her story, yet she had given it. And though the night beyond the cabin still carried the echoes of cruelty and gossip, within these walls something fragile had been exchanged. Sorrow, laid bare without shame. The roof creaked as the wind passed over it. The rocking chair stirred slightly in the draft. The herbs above the stove shifted, their scent mingling with the smoke, and two figures, once bound by nothing more than survival, sat together in the fire's glow, their griefs no longer entirely alone. Winter came down hard across the prairie, white and unrelenting. Snow swept in from the north, covering the fields in drifts that swallowed fence posts and bent the cottonwoods beneath its weight. The wind carried sharp teeth, gnawing at the walls of the cabin, slipping through cracks no cloth could fully seal. Days shortened into pale slivers of light. Nights stretched long and heavy, their silence broken only by the cry of wolves and the groaning timbers of the house. Food grew scarce, but they endured. Luke trapped rabbits along the tree line, their small bodies a meager answer to hunger. Nalin ground the last of the wheat into coarse bread, baking it on flat stones near the fire. They ate sparingly, sharing coffee when they could, water when they could not. Each small meal was an act of quiet resilience, a refusal to yield to the season's cruelty. One evening, when the storm outside had lulled to a hush and snow fell in thick, silent flakes, Luke found himself pulling a box from beneath the bed. It was worn, the wood scarred from years of handling, its hinges stiff with rust. He set it near the hearth, his movements slow, deliberate, as though approaching something sacred. Nalin, seated by the fire, lifted her eyes. She watched without question as he opened the box, revealing what lay within, a folded dress wrapped in linen yellowed with time. The fabric was fragile, but the shape unmistakable, his wife's wedding dress. Luke lifted it with both hands, the weight lighter than he remembered, the sight heavier. He stared at the fire, at the logs crackling and spitting, and for a moment he considered feeding the dress to the flames. It would be simple. One gesture, one release. The past burned away, leaving nothing but ash. His hands trembled on the fabric, torn between memory and surrender. Nalin rose without a word. She crossed the small room and knelt beside him. Her hands, steady and unhurried, reached for the dress. Luke let her take it, though his fingers lingered on the cloth before falling back to his knees. She spread the dress across her lap, smoothing the wrinkles with care. Her touch was reverent yet not fearful. She did not treat it as a relic to be worshipped, nor as a burden to be discarded. It was fabric, yes, but fabric steeped in meaning, in love, in loss. She acknowledged both. And in that acknowledgement something softened. From her braid she pulled a single thread, a loose strand caught near the binding. With a small, precise motion, she tore a strip from the hem of the dress, just wide enough to weave. Luke's breath caught, but he did not stop her. She wound the strip into her braid, tying past to present in a gesture more eloquent than any words. Luke felt something shift inside him then, not the sharp pang of grief, but a loosening, as though a knot bound tight in his chest had been eased. The fire popped, casting sparks up the chimney, and he realized he was breathing differently, less shallow, less weighted. Nalin met his gaze. Her eyes, dark and steady, held no demand, only truth. She returned the dress to him, folded neatly once more, as though it belonged not to the dead, nor to the living, but to the space between. That night their silence broke, not with passion, but with trust. Nalin sat before the fire, her back to him. Slowly she began to unweave her braids. The strands fell loose, dark rivers spilling across her shoulders. Luke watched, struck by the intimacy of the act. Among her people, he knew, hair was not merely ornament but identity, lineage, strength. To unbraid it here before him was to lower a wall higher than words could breach. He moved closer, not touching but near enough that his presence was unmistakable. His hand hovered once at her shoulder, then fell back, refusing to force what must be freely given. She did not flinch, did not retreat. The firelight warmed her skin, and the loose strands gleamed like ink under flame. She turned her head slightly, enough that he could see her profile, softened by the glow. His hand lingered near hers on the floor, close enough that the heat of her skin mingled with his own. They did not clasp hands, but neither pulled away. The space between them was no longer absence. It was a bridge, fragile but real. The rocking chair creaked faintly as Luke sat back, and after a pause, Nalin joined him. The chair, built for one, held them both in its narrow embrace. He felt the warmth of her beside him, steady, unspoken, grounding. Together they looked into the fire, its light flickering across the walls, softening the sharp lines of solitude. For the first time in years, Luke did not feel the house pressing down on him. He felt it sheltering him, enclosing not emptiness but something shared. The herbs above the stove swayed gently in the draft, their scent mingling with the smoke. Outside, snow fell in silence, blanketing the land in white. Inside, the fire burned steady, and two souls sat not as strangers, not as possessions, but as companions, tentative yet true. Love had not been claimed, nor bartered. It had not been forced into being by bargain or by need. It had grown quietly in the soil of shared silence, watered by grief, warmed by fire. And in that moment, Luke understood. It did not need to be more than this. It only needed to be real. Spring broke over the prairie in hesitant strokes, the snow retreating in patches, the earth releasing its thaw with the smell of damp soil and new grass. The air softened, though the wind still carried a knife's edge at dusk. Luke's cabin stood weathered but unbowed, its logs darkened from winter storms, its roof patched with scars of cloth and timber. Life, too, had patched itself within those walls. Chickens scratched again in the yard, their clucks a fragile kind of music. Nalin set herbs outside to dry in the sun, the smoke-stained winter shawl folded neatly away. Luke, his shoulders still stiff from cold and labor, repaired fence lines and turned soil with the old plow. They worked side by side without speech, yet there was an ease to the silence now, the comfort of knowing what the other's presence meant. But peace in those parts was a brittle thing, easily shattered. It was near sundown when the riders came, three shadows against the horizon, staggering from whiskey and ill intent. One voice rose before the others, slurred yet sharp, the same man who had ridden up months ago with words like poison. Luke Halpern. He bellowed across the yard. You paid 2 drinks and a sack of wheat for that squaw. Fair's fair. But a man don't keep what he won't defend. Luke's blood chilled, though his face betrayed nothing. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, his body framed by the glow spilling from the doorway. You've had your say, he called back. Now turn your horses and be gone. Laughter answered him, jagged and ugly. One of the men leveled his weapon. The crack of a rifle split the air, shattering a board beside the door, sending splinters flying. The hen scattered, shrieking. Another shot followed, punching a hole clean through the cabin wall. Luke fired back, steady though his heart thundered. His shot tore into the dirt by the riders' hooves, enough to jolt their horses sideways. Yet before he could fire again, pain seared his shoulder. The force spun him half around, the rifle slipping from his grasp. He staggered against the doorframe, his breath ripped ragged from his chest. Inside, Nalin had already moved. She caught the rifle before it struck the ground, her hands sure, her movements swift as water. With a calmness born not of fearlessness but of necessity, she braced the barrel against the doorframe, her braid swinging forward as she leaned into the aim. She fired. Once, twice. Each shot rang clean, ringing out across the empty land. One man yelped, clutching at his arm. Another dropped his hat, nearly unseated by his spooked horse. The third cursed and pulled hard on the reins, retreating into the dusk. The riders did not linger. Their laughter had soured into shouts of pain and fury, retreating into the distance like wolves driven back from firelight. Silence fell heavy. Only the hiss of the evening wind remained. Nalin lowered the rifle, smoke curling from its mouth. She turned then, her face lit by the last flame of sunset. Luke, pale and swaying, met her gaze. Blood stained his shirt at the shoulder, warm and steady. "You—" His words caught, torn by pain, yet he forced them through. "You saved me." She moved to him without hesitation, guiding him inside, laying him near the fire. Her hands pressed cloth to his wound. Steady though her eyes carried a storm of their own. Luke grasped her wrist, weak but unyielding. "You're not mine," he said, voice rough, broken. "Not bought. Not bound. You're my partner. The only reason I draw breath tonight." For a long moment she held his gaze, her silence as weighty as truth itself. Then with a nod she returned to her task, tending him through the long night. Days passed. Luke healed, slow but certain, the wound knitting beneath Nalin's vigilant care. He rose again to work, though his arm carried new stiffness. The time came when he could no longer put off the journey to town. Supplies needed fetching, debts required paying. He saddled his horse at dawn, grimacing against the pull in his shoulder. But he did not ride alone. Nalin mounted beside him, her back straight, her braid threaded still with the strip of his wife's old dress. Together they rode the miles of open prairie, the sky vast above them, the earth softening with spring's rebirth. When they entered town, all heads turned. The blacksmith paused mid-swing. The storekeeper's wife froze with a bucket in her hands, and men leaned against posts with narrowed eyes. Whispers stirred like leaves. Luke did not falter. He rode straight to the store, dismounted, and extended his hand not to the door but to Nalin. She stepped down beside him, her face calm, her dignity unshaken. "This is Nalin," Luke said to the silence that gathered. His voice carried, low but unyielding. "She is the woman who saved my life." Some turned away, muttering. Others stared, uncertain. But no voice rose to challenge him. The weight of his words, the truth of his posture, left little room for jest or insult. Together they walked into the store, side by side. And when their business was done, they mounted once more and rode home, not as strangers bound by trade, but as companions bound by scars, by firelight, by a hard-won trust that no man's laughter could undo. The prairie stretched before them, wide and unending, yet not empty. The land had taken much, but it had given too. Second chances. A measure of dignity. A love not spoken loud but steady as the earth beneath their horses' hooves. The sun dipped low and the road wound back toward the cabin that waited for them both. Luke glanced once at Nalin, the wind tugging at her braid, the fabric strip fluttering like a banner. She did not look back, but her nearness was enough. They rode on, into the deepening light, not as buyer and bought, not as settler and captive, but as two souls who had weathered storm and fire and come out the other side, scarred yet unbroken.